This video is sponsored by World Anvil. Can you get too focused on one aspect of your world building? And if so, what does that look like? And how are the Jedi from Star Wars a perfect example of this problem in action? Earlier this month, I put out a video about the Pirates of the Caribbean films and the villains we can steal from them for our D&D games. If you haven't watched it, go check it out. It's a great video, I'm really proud of it. And in that video, I more or less started discussing the first aspect of my homebrew world that I've shared with anyone, a region known as the Sea of Curses. Now my goal is to flesh that region out with a PDF and share it on my Patreon. This isn't me announcing I've done that, to be clear. Some other folks have commissioned some D&D PDFs, so I need to do those first before I can dive into the Sea of Curses, pun intended. However, once I make that Sea of Curses PDF, it's entirely possible that some people may want more from that region. More details for islands, more information about other factions and settlements, that kind of thing. And if I get particularly inspired to add more details, I'll probably do just that. But my next world building goal will be to move away from that area of the map and start building something else for the setting. Something that doesn't involve any of the same locations or factions or MacGuffins. And I have to make that a conscious choice, because I want to avoid something I call Whirlpool world building. But what is Whirlpool world building? That's what we're talking about today. This video was voted on by my patrons and YouTube members who support me at $15 a month. They can vote in polls to help choose some of these videos, and I've got another one of those polls up right now, so if you're a supporter at the Fabricate tier or higher, you have until August 1st to choose which of these video topics I should cover next. We'll be talking about fantasy names when world building, lessons from the D&D movie, a video about not sharing your character classes with the group, or a video about Ed Sheeran, which is also a video about D&D. They're all D&D videos, to be clear. Those are all topics I do plan to cover at some point, but you can help decide which one you'd like to see next. Once again, that poll will be up until August 1st, so go check that out. Now on with the show. Whirlpool world building has nothing to do with a literal whirlpool or water of any kind, despite the fact that I did bring it up in the context of the seafaring corner of my campaign setting. That was just a coincidence. Whirlpool world building is a term I use when there's some aspect of a setting that just keeps pulling the focus of the creatives behind the scenes. They might even want to try to get away from it, but they can't seem to, because eventually they find themselves drawn back to what they consider to be the most interesting part of the world or its lore. Some examples in pop culture might include the Jedi in Star Wars, Sauron in Tolkien adaptations, Hogwarts in the Harry Potter setting, and even arguably the Calamity in Critical Role. I think that actually qualifies as well. Now I want to be clear right up front. Just because something focuses on this aspect of world building, that doesn't mean that it's bad. EXU Calamity is incredible. I enjoy more of the Star Wars shows than most people seem to. Harry Potter, okay, even without getting into how J.K. Rowling has fully embraced transphobia, the Harry Potter franchise has some major problems, and I am going to dunk on it a little bit later, but, people still do like Harry Potter despite its plot issues. And if they don't, Whirlpool world building usually isn't the reason why. So you can fall into the Whirlpool, or even dive into the Whirlpool, and still tell a good story. The phenomenon I'm describing isn't indicative of a black mark on a property because it dares to go back into the Whirlpool. I would imagine every creator thinks they're doing something interesting with the material they revisit, and plenty of them actually do find something interesting to say or do or explore. But overall, it does speak to a pattern that these franchises all seem to have some aspect of the world that acts like a whirlpool and it keeps sucking new stories into it. And that pattern can be kind of a problem. Now, it is fully possible that what I'm going to talk about today just doesn't bother you. In fact, I might get to the end of this video and you still might not agree with me, and that's totally fair. But this is something I think about all the time. I think it's a problem that, across the franchise, Rowling's wizarding world can't escape Hogwarts, Star Wars can't leave the Jedi alone, and so many aspects of Critical Role's ongoing adventures keep tying back to the Calamity. Because whenever you fall into the Whirlpool, the fictional world seems just a little bit smaller. It seems simpler, it seems less real. And sometimes, the pull of that Whirlpool can really pull you off course. Of course, one of the best ways to keep your world from seeming smaller than you intend is to make an effort to distance yourself from what you've already spent a lot of time focusing on, and we'll talk about that later. But I know it can be hard to teach yourself how to world build in a way that you're not used to, or to focus on an aspect of world building that you don't have a lot of familiarity with. But thankfully you can get help from today's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is a fantastic resource that allows you to create articles for your campaign setting, which you can then share with your players. They've got incredible templates which make your articles look professional and easy to read. And they also have a brand new, robust Learn section on their website. You can learn about world building topics like building religions, using biomes and fantasy jobs, what should go into a fantasy castle, that sort of thing. But they also have tutorials on game mastering, and how to get the most out of using World Anvil for your setting or your game or your manuscript. And World Anvil is offering a discount to the viewers of this channel. If you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you can save 51% off of any annual membership. Once again, that's worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. When I think of a whirlpool that pulls new projects into its vortex, one example I always go to is the Jedi. When I first watched the trailer for the new Star Wars show, The Acolyte, I was a little bit discouraged. And not for any reason other than because it's yet another Star Wars show all about the Jedi. Now obviously shows that focus on established Jedi characters like Obi-Wan and Ahsoka are automatically going to have some Jedi in them. And I thought the Obi-Wan show was fine. I had fun watching it, but outside of a few scenes, it was mostly forgettable after the fact. I haven't seen Ahsoka because I've only seen a few episodes of Rebels, and Ahsoka seems like a direct sequel to that show, so I can't really speak to the quality of either Rebels or Ahsoka. But I don't mind the fact that there are Star Wars shows about the Jedi. That's not my point. It makes perfect sense. But to see the true impact of the Jedi Whirlpool in action, all we have to do is look at The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett. I really liked Season 1 of The Mandalorian, but then the second season put so much emphasis on introducing a Jedi to teach Baby Yoda, and ended with the gratuitous Luke Skywalker cameo, which didn't just look terrible, although it definitely did, but was also everything I didn't want from the show. And then we got the, frankly, painful episode of the Book of Boba Fett, where we cut back to Luke and Baby Yoda, and the entire story ground to a halt for, no joke, 20 Christian minutes so we could watch Baby Yoda learn how to do force jumps, and nothing else. And then the episode made a big dramatic moment out of the question of whether Baby Yoda is going to stay with Luke or go back to his adoptive father. And I don't know, if the big dramatic question of your scene is, do you want to go back to being a main character on The Mandalorian, the most popular new Star Wars show ever, or would you rather stay at school where we all know all the students will get murdered in a few years? I think I already know what he's going to choose, actually. And I think this could have been avoidable, but I think that's the danger of the Jedi Whirlpool. Yes, obviously, I personally think the Luke scenes from the new Star Wars TV shows are all terrible, not just because of the effects, but also because the creators don't seem to understand the character, and I'll talk more about that some other day. Maybe on a separate channel designed to talk about pop culture outside of D&D, maybe keep an eye out for that soon. But also, the Jedi are this gravitational pull that so many creators on the franchise can't seem to escape. I haven't even talked about the new Jedi video games, and I really liked that first game. I had fun playing it, and the Order 66 flashback scene was genuinely incredible. But again, if you frame your big dramatic question as, will this character I've never heard of start a new Jedi Academy several years before the original Star Wars movies, I'm afraid I already know what the answer is going to be. Now, this is essentially the issue with prequels, which is why I'm glad we're finally getting a standalone Rey movie, because somebody needs to push the story forward. The timeline needs to advance so we can stop making prequels for Star Wars. But this is also why I'm excited for Star Wars stories that aren't just about the Jedi anymore. I think it's part of why Rogue One felt like such a breath of fresh air. That movie is pretty messy, it starts pretty rough, and gets better with every act, but the end of that movie rules, because it really does just get to be a story about fighting the Empire, which doesn't fall into the Jedi Whirlpool. Although that's not entirely accurate. One of the best characters in the movie is Donnie Yen's character, Chirrut Imre, who is Force-sensitive and reveres the Force, despite not being a Jedi himself. And in fairness, when you do dip into the Whirlpool like this, you can tell a story that specifically explores the implications of that original concept in more detail, and maybe do something interesting with it. That's why so many creators return to the Whirlpool over and over, because, ideally, they feel like there's more to explore there. In fact, that seems to be what the Acolyte is going for. It wants to explore some of the themes of the prequel films as well as some of the themes of the High Republic novels. And just because it dives into the Whirlpool, that doesn't mean it's bad. Of course, I haven't actually seen it yet, and the reaction to the show is really mixed, but I'm making a video that literally talks about the Jedi, so I should watch the show. In fact, hang on, I'll be right back. Okay, I had a lot of fun with that show. It's not perfect. A lot of the characters feel kind of thin, and some of their motivations aren't really fully understood when they actually do things, but I honestly think you could have solved all my problems with the show by just making the episodes longer. Half the episodes were under 40 minutes long, and that runtime includes these 6 minutes of credits that come with every Disney Plus show, so that's not a lot of time to tell your story. One of the reasons I love the finale is because it gave us 42 minutes of story. That's the length of an episode of TV. It was enough time to actually tell a story. It was great. But in general, I actually really like what the show was going for. I like the themes at play. I like a lot of the story beats. They just felt a little rushed. And some of the characters, like Sol and the villain, were fantastic. And the lightsaber fights were incredible. Now, I've seen the reactions to the show, so I know not everyone agrees with me about the overall quality of the series. Some people loved it a lot more than me, whereas other people were way more bothered by the things I felt like I could just shrug off. For example, maybe the pacing really bothered them a lot more than it bothered me because, well, probably because I watched a few episodes per day in preparation for this video, and they watched it week to week, and that would absolutely change how the season feels when you're watching it. There are also people who had complaints much more tied into, let's say, their own personal idiosyncratic philosophies of what Star Wars should be about. And then there are the folks who never really seemed willing to give it a chance at all, and tried to use canon to pick it apart, declaring that the show had broke canon before the season had even finished, because they weren't interested in giving it the benefit of the doubt. And listen, people can feel however they want about art. I'm not trying to tell anyone how they should react. I don't care if you like the show. I would sometimes have the same thought as a lot of those critics, but then usually I'd follow it up by thinking, huh, that's weird, but I bet the show's going to explain it. And then they usually did. I'm trying to choose my words carefully here, because I do understand why people came into the show already jaded about Disney Star Wars and assumed the show was not going to tie up loose ends, because that's kind of what happened with the sequel trilogy. Even if I don't share that sentiment, I do get where it comes from. But there are also some people whose constant critiques were so easily disproven, even if you didn't watch the show. In fact, I was disproving a lot of those arguments on Twitter without watching the show. I went viral for doing that. And so that tells me these people are either weaponizing the anger of bitter fans for engagement because it just makes them more money, or they're just bad at watching TV, and possibly they're just deeply stupid people. Although, isn't it weird how many of them were upset with the show the moment a queer woman was announced as the showrunner, or a queer person of color was cast as the lead? That's super weird. Probably a total coincidence that the show was review bombed for featuring women and people of color in such prominent roles. If that's your complaint, log off, touch grass, or just grow the fuck up. But once again, I don't think the show is perfect, and if you're willing to engage in good faith criticism, I think the show had a lot of really interesting ideas and just didn't deliver on them as well as it could have. And there are lessons to be learned from that. In a way, the show has a lot in common with Rogue One. They're both messy stories that are centered around concepts that I think are really interesting. They're just maybe not executed quite as well as I would have liked. The Acolyte just needed more time to tell the story, and Rogue One, well, they had to do a lot of work in reshoots to write that ship, so I honestly don't know how you could clean up the first act of that movie without literally taking the movie back in time to show the creators the final product so they could see what works and what doesn't before they get locked into anything they couldn't reshoot. Honestly, the Star Wars prequels have a similar problem to both these projects. Some great thematic ideas, not great execution. But plenty of people have already talked about the Star Wars prequels. I'm not going to add anything today. I mean, I do have plenty to say about the Star Wars prequels, and I will discuss them in the future, maybe on a separate channel or whatever, but not right now. But I do really like the way the Acolyte basically explores the end of the High Republic era of the Jedi. Yes, they dove right into the Whirlpool, so once again we have a show that's all about the Jedi, but in doing so, they explore things I wish we'd seen handled better in other Star Wars projects like the prequels. It plays with some of those themes that we saw in both the prequel and sequel trilogies, and takes a different approach to them, and I appreciate that. Speaking of prequels, let's talk a little bit about Sauron from The Lord of the Rings, and how he's appeared in the Lord of the Rings prequels that have been produced. Now, I'm not a Tolkien expert, so this really isn't going to be a discussion about canon or lore. We're just talking about entertaining stories. And the Hobbit book is a very entertaining story. And in that story, Gandalf keeps having to leave the party to go do other stuff because Tolkien needed him off the board in order to raise the stakes and increase the tension for his story. And at least one of those times, Gandalf's absence is justified with the explanation that he had to go deal with a necromancer. When Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings, he retconned this fact so the necromancer was actually Sauron. Presumably this was done to retroactively better justify Gandalf's absences by tying them to the new story. This is the same thing we can actually do as game masters. We can take our high-level NPCs off the field to go deal with some other threat, and then as the heroes get to higher levels, or you run a new campaign, you can establish that those errands were actually foreshadowing for this new adventure, which is essentially what Tolkien did with The Lord of the Rings. And obviously I'm not trying to take down J.R.R. Tolkien. I couldn't have written The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, and as I hope I made clear in the first section of this video, it's absolutely possible for creators I respect to fall into the Whirlpool. But when everything does revolve around Sauron, then it feels to me like he's the one big problem the heroes of this world need to deal with, and so he becomes a whirlpool that draws everyone toward him. And this is the next danger with Whirlpool world building. It makes the world seem small. The live-action Hobbit films of the 2010s fell into every prequel trap you could imagine, but chief among them were the scenes that leaned way too hard into connections to the original trilogy. So now, Gandalf doesn't just go off to deal with the necromancer off-screen, we see it play out. And that's not a terrible idea in theory, but in practice we get this terrible sequence in the Hobbit films where Gandalf and Galadriel and Elrond and Saruman have an interminably long, agonizingly frustrating sequence where they fight Sauron, and it's a big deal, and it just grinds the main Hobbit story to a halt, because really the creators realized halfway through production they just wanted to make another Lord of the Rings trilogy, and they're hoping that we didn't notice that those were not the movies we paid to see. And then a couple of years ago, Amazon released the first season of The Rings of Power, which is entirely focused on Sauron's rise to power, no pun intended. And this one is complicated because legally the creators couldn't adapt the Silmarillion, so they truly had to take elements of the Lord of the Rings appendices and use those as the springboard for the most expensive TV show ever made. Now once again, I haven't seen the first season of Rings of Power yet, but I remember people were really harsh toward the show when it was airing. And then people were pretty harsh toward The Acolyte as well, and I enjoyed that. You know what? Hold on.
20 years may be the blink of an eye to an elf, but I've lived an entire life in that time.
Oh, hey, I actually really liked that show. That's the show that everyone was mad about? Sure, okay, if you understand the Tolkien lore, I would totally get being frustrated that the show couldn't adapt it faithfully. But I thought that show was fantastic. It's actually kind of the opposite of The Acolyte. I don't know if the plot of the first season of Rings of Power makes a ton of sense. It definitely has some plot holes and some contrivances. But the individual episodes were great. I enjoyed the whole season overall. The acting was fantastic. The writing was excellent. The show looks amazing. I don't know, I thought that show was great. And it's not entirely about Sauron. There are other subplots, but I thought the show did a nice job of tying all those subplots together by the end of the season, so everything actually felt cohesive and like it was all building toward the events of the finale. I thought that was great TV. But obviously, it is still about Sauron. And in fact, the one thing I remember hearing about the show when it was coming out, besides people whining that it's diverse and therefore bad and or not faithful to Tolkien, and honestly, who gives a shit about that? Seriously, grow up. I'm not saying something can't be bad because it wasn't in the original text. The Hobbit films are full of baffling choices. But if you can't make an actual critique besides forced diversity, shut the fuck up. But the other thing I remember hearing at the time was people speculating about who in the show was secretly Sauron. This wasn't like how some fans speculate about things that don't matter. This isn't like the question about who Snoke is in The Force Awakens, which is not a question the film was even asking you to speculate about. This is something the show does seem to be aware fans would be theorizing about. Multiple characters are presented as potentially being secretly Sauron throughout the course of that first season. But that idea must have also come from the marketing or the interviews or something, because if I'd only watched the show and didn't have that context, I wouldn't have known that's something I was supposed to be speculating about, besides the obvious red herrings. And certainly I wouldn't have guessed the right answer the way some people did. So once again, I like the show, but it certainly did steer into the Sauron whirlpool. And the reason I think this matters is because I feel like it runs counter to everything Tolkien was trying to say with his writing. Again, I'm hardly a Tolkien expert, but I feel like it was a pretty big deal to him that Sauron wasn't the greatest evil Middle-earth had ever known. It was important to establish that there had been other evils, and yes, Sauron represented a similar, yet less impressive threat, because the entire world is getting less and less impressive. The heroes and villains are all basically pale imitations of other forces that have been at work in Middle-earth. Now, once again, just because something is different does not automatically make it bad. And again, in the case of Rings of Power, it seems like there have been legal reasons why they literally couldn't make a show about fighting Morgoth instead of fighting Sauron, even if they'd wanted to. And again, I'm not saying they're not allowed to make a show about Sauron forging the Rings of Power. I mean, I certainly wasn't asking for a TV show to adapt the first few lines of text from Fellowship of the Ring, but I really enjoyed the final product. But I do think that when Sauron is the only major bad guy we keep seeing across 6 live-action movies and a TV show set across all these different eras of Middle-earth history, it does make the world seem a lot smaller than it maybe should. Of course, there are some times where falling into the whirlpool does really screw with the quality of your story. And so let's talk about Hogwarts. Now let's be clear, we're going to discuss the Harry Potter franchise on its own terms, the strengths and weaknesses that come from the writing choices made when you fall into the Hogwarts world-building whirlpool. But also, just a reminder, J.K. Rowling is a massive transphobe. She uses her platform to spread hate. She doesn't seem to care about anything else. The hate has completely ruined her brain and destroyed her goodwill. Fuck her, she sucks. That's not why I'm criticizing her work today. I generally like the Harry Potter books, despite the flaws that get more and more noticeable every year. I was never as big on the movies as most people were, but I do think some of the Harry Potter movies are pretty good. But the point is, I'm just going to talk about her writing without bias or prejudice. I only bring this up because since the last time I talked about her on this channel, she's literally started denying Nazi crimes. So it feels weird to not at least mention how much she sucks. By the way, if anyone in the comments says, what has she actually done that's transphobic? Ignore them. Don't waste your energy on them. They are not worth your time. They could just Google it and read about it themselves. There are several resources that have gathered that information, but they don't want to read that, or they have read it and they still don't get it. So either way, don't let their lack of critical thinking become your problem. Just live your life and ignore them. Cool? Cool. Now, for those of us who enjoyed Harry Potter as kids, Hogwarts was a fun place where we could imagine ourselves spending a lot of time. But to illustrate the dangers of the whirlpool, I actually want to start with this clip of Brennan Lee Mulligan and Matt Mercer discussing the Harry Potter world building. Again, for context, this was at least a couple of years before we knew just how toxic Rowling was as a human being. In the more innocent times.
And you get a lot of people who will come out and be like, good world building is like, you need to know the logistics of the trade routes between this and the topography of rivers and this and that. And that's all awesome if the vibe of your setting is one of hyperrealism. Amongst some certain circles, this is a hot take. I go, Harry Potter has the best world building of almost any fantasy series that I can recall. And people will be like, what? Why? Like, what's the world building Harry Potter got going for it? People to this day know what their Hogwarts house is. That's good world building. Why do I bring that up? Because the logistics of Harry Potter are fucking nonsense. Yeah. They're fucking crazy. If you've got a civilization of wizards who can teleport at will, and they have their mail delivered by nature's slowest bird, that's fucking animal cruelty. That's not okay. And I know what you're gonna say. You're gonna say you can't apparate in the grounds of Hogwarts. Why are we running our civilization based on the bylaws of one school?
Yeah, Hogwarts is the Illuminati. They run the world because if you can do the things they're doing, why the fuck would they not be just helming the future of society and becoming just an entirely oppressive political force that nobody could argue against?
And also on the flip side, if you're not an oppressive political force, you're just allowing the horrors of the world to happen. Like, you've got to make a move at some point. All of that is, I say, with only the utmost love.
Of course.
Because I treasure those books. I've read them so many times. Remember that a setting's strength is not only logistics, it's also bum ba bum 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 bum, and a fucking owl, and it flies, and the wands, and like the little boarding school uniforms. All of that stuff actually has, I would say, a heavier pragmatic weight on what brings joy to your players.
Yeah.
Which let's not forget is the point.
Now, Brennan's ultimate point is that, sure, if you pull on the thread, the world of Harry Potter pretty much unravels. But that wasn't the point of those books. The goal was to present Hogwarts as wish fulfillment for kids, not to try to grapple with more nuanced ideas of politics and the ethical ramifications of wielding that sort of magical or institutional power. That's not to say that none of that is present in the story, even unconsciously, as many have discussed in recent years as they've reassessed the franchise. But if you're engaging with the books the way they're intended to be read, all this stuff is secondary to the intended message. Despite the fairly conservative messaging in the books, you can still handwave a lot of that stuff away at first glance, simply because that's not the point of the books. Like, Harry Potter is about fun escapism. It's not about decades of world building and explaining how major historical events still shook out the same way even though there were secret wizards running around. Nobody is seriously reading Harry Potter and asking why the wizards didn't stop World War II, because the obvious answer is, because it's a kid's book, don't worry about it. But of course, then the franchise continued past the original books. We got The Cursed Child, which reads like bad fanfiction, arguing that actually it was cool and good that Cedric Diggory died in the 4th book, because if he hadn't died, he would have turned out to be evil and the wizard Nazis would have taken over the world. Which is such a weirdly defensive reaction. It's like Rowling thought people were criticizing the choice to kill Cedric, so she had to justify it within the text, but people weren't saying that it shouldn't have been written that way. They were just sad because a sad thing happened in a book. Cedric's death is actually my favorite part in any of the movies because it is so human and so well done. You didn't need to retroactively explain that the tragedy was actually a good thing for everyone. It just makes you sound like the bad guy in a Spider-Verse movie. But then we got the Fantastic Beasts films and the wheels came off the bus. The first movie is mostly a fun adventure where a friendly, unassuming protagonist tracks down a bunch of Pokemon. But the film is starting to show some issues. For example, we see the American wizard government, but we've lost a lot of the whimsy of the Harry Potter movies because this movie's made for adults who grew up with Harry Potter. Sure, there's gold filigree and sweeping music and weird clocks, but there's also intense interrogation rooms and immediate execution sentencing. You don't get the same fun escapism that Hogwarts provided because, quite frankly, Rowling is not as talented at making goofy world-building versions of government agencies. Unlike, the folks who work at Pixar. Those people actually can make government agencies and bureaucracy fun and entertaining and enjoyable as world-building. But the movie itself was still enjoyable enough, and Eddie Redmayne and especially Dan Folger are very charming leads. There's this weird subplot that feels like it's from an entirely different movie where Colin Farrell, who gives a great performance, he's a villain manipulating Ezra Miller's character who, for some reason, is being played with absolutely no charisma, which is a really strange choice given that for Ezra Miller's many, many faults, they can be entertaining to watch. There's just nothing like that for this character. They're just a void of energy or empathy. And then at the end of the film, these subplots come together well enough. They fight the big monster, Ezra Miller blows up, it's very sad. But then Colin Farrell turns out to be secretly Johnny Depp in disguise, covered in very eccentric makeup, doing a weird accent, and even for the audience that had only barely heard any of the allegations from Amber Heard at that time, he had just come off of The Lone Ranger, the Alice in Wonderland films, Black Mass, Mordecai. Every audience member in my screening felt their buttholes pucker as they realized we had just lost Colin Farrell in favor of Johnny Depp doing a shtick that had already gotten pretty old. And honestly, even if you do believe his side of the story about his relationship with Amber Heard, which you shouldn't, he lied on the stand, he has a well-documented history of this kind of behavior, I fell for it too. I get it, it does not feel good to admit, but we do kind of have to own the fact that we bet on the wrong horse there. But even if you do believe his side of the story, you have to acknowledge that at this point in history, his performances were not getting audiences excited about watching more of him, and here he was, showing up in the denouement of the Fantastic Beasts movie, and now we were all realizing with this cold shiver that this fun Magic Animals movie was about to be the first installment in another franchise about fighting an evil wizard Nazi, and people were not into it. And then we got the sequel, Fantastic Beasts: The Crimes of Grindelwald. And boy oh boy, it fell right into the Hogwarts whirlpool, and everybody hated it. I didn't actually see it, I only heard about how terrible it was. Although I heard people hated the Acolyte, and I liked that. And I heard Rings of Power was terrible, but I thought that was great. I wonder.
It is said that I hate les noms magiques. The magus. The no-mage. The count spell.
No, it's bad. I mean, it's not the worst movie I've watched this month. Pirates 5 is way worse. Wow. late 2010s Johnny Depp was really serving up a steady flow of crap. We did not lose much when he got canceled. But to be fair, the movie does have some good parts to it. There's a great scene of Newt and Jacob tracking down a big magic lion, and it feels the most like a scene from the first movie. There's a really cute scene where Newt tries to flirt with Tina and makes up an expression that no one else uses and then kind of admits to it. It really works. There's a great scene where Newt takes Polyjuice Potion to pose as his brother and sneak into the Ministry of Magic, but his brother is already there and spots him immediately. It's fun to watch that plan immediately fail. And Jude Law is fantastic as Dumbledore. He's great casting. Who doesn't love Jude Law? But speaking of Dumbledore, there's also an extended sequence at Hogwarts. Who doesn't love Hogwarts? Not sure why we spent so much time there in this movie, but I guess it's cute to see it again. Jacob also has a scene with Nicholas Flamel, and you're like, yeah, oh yeah, he made the MacGuffin from the first Harry Potter book. I guess it's interesting to see what he's like. I wasn't really curious about that or anything, and he doesn't really do anything in the movie that had to be done by that specific character, and they also make it seem like he's immortal just because he's an alchemist, and that doesn't make any sense. That's not how it worked. And also, he's ancient and fragile, which doesn't make immortality seem that appealing, so that also doesn't make any sense, but it's still neat to see him, I guess. We get to see McGonagall working at Hogwarts, and okay, everyone kind of thought that she hadn't even been born yet by this point in the timeline, but whatever, writers can retcon things if they better serve the story. Besides, McGonagall's a pretty minor character. Her age isn't important. She's not Harry Potter, or a really important character like Coyote Mundi. But of course, that idea of serving the story was kind of the problem. Because as the audience was watching the movie, or even just seeing the trailers, we were all having the same thought. Why is this a Fantastic Beasts movie? Because we were now 2 movies into a threatened to be a 5-movie-long franchise, and already we were back at Hogwarts hearing a bunch of familiar names like Dumbledore and McGonagall and Flamel and Lestrange, and getting ready to fight yet another evil wizard Nazi. Except now the franchise was running face first into exactly the problem it had pretty easily avoided back when it was a kid's story set at a school. Because now not only is it impossible for this franchise to ignore the ramifications of a wizarding world, but it's actively trying to expand its reach and cover more topics. And so, without anybody actually asking it to do so, it decides to stop and explain why the wizards didn't stop World War II. And the explanation they land on is absolutely insane. Because Grindelwald is trying to argue that wizards should rule over the muggles, and to make his case, he vapes from a skull and shows a vision of the future where we see the atrocities of World War II. Tanks and planes and the atom bomb, and crowds of people getting on a train. And the good guys still want to stop him because he's a wizard supremacist and an all-around bad guy. And so we are now watching a franchise where the best case scenario is that the wizard protagonists stop the bad guy who is, essentially, trying to stop World War II. The film flat out tells us that if the good guys win, it will directly ensure the Muggles have to deal with Hiroshima and the Holocaust.
Oh, there it is. We did it, Brian. We made 9/11 happen. High five!
All right, high five!
Well, that probably wouldn't look very good out of context.
And if I'm making it sound like this is presented as a moral quandary for our main characters, I have to clarify that it does not make any impact on them. They don't care at all. But this is what can happen when you get pulled into the whirlpool. A story that would stand alone is now yanked in a direction that it is not compatible with. Your fun, lighthearted adventure romp suddenly involves foreshadowing of Dumbledore's earliest enemy and romance partner, which means he would be a great enemy for a Dumbledore franchise, but that's not the movie you were making. So they just switched, and once again, they start doing that franchise and hoping the audience doesn't notice that suddenly this is a movie series about Dumbledore and Grindelwald. Plus, now they're having to work overtime to add some Fantastic Beasts, so the title of this franchise has any hope of making sense. There are new colorful creatures that pop up every 20 minutes in the movie, but they just show up coincidentally. They're not so deeply tied into the story like they are with the first movie. They're simply there to justify Newt being able to use his animal knowledge a couple of times. And because you set the movies in the 1920s and you gave your villain a goal that specifically has to deal with the Muggle world because he wants to take it over, now you've set up the franchise so you have to answer the question that has no good answer. Why didn't the wizards stop World War II? And nobody made you do that. That is entirely a self-own. By the way, when the third movie was announced, I asked my friend Jeffrey Gardner if he could guess the title of the third film, knowing what the second movie had been about, and his first guess was, I kid you not, The Secret of Dumbledore. He nailed it in one. Because the franchise was completely, nakedly desperate to be just about Dumbledore instead of doing its own thing. Also, this is totally unrelated to most of what we've been talking about, but I had to mention it because I haven't seen anybody else talk about this. In the second Fantastic Beasts movie, one of Grindelwald's henchmen sneaks into the Ministry of Magic by drinking Polyjuice Potion to disguise himself as a woman, and when it wears off, he's just a man dressed as a woman. Again, to be clear, a man sneaks into a secure space by wearing women's clothing. Joe, are you okay? Do you need professional help? Because you seem obsessed. It is not good for you. Now, despite all the shit I've talked today about these major franchises, when we're talking about running RPG games for our friends, there is an argument in favor of Whirlpool world building. When you're running a game for your players, it is a lot to ask them to keep track of multiple aspects of your homebrew world. So if everything keeps tying back to one focus point, it does make it easier for your players. As an example, we can look at the Calamity on Critical Role. I'll remain vague about anything we haven't covered in our Demystified series, so no real spoilers for the back half of Campaign 1 or for Campaigns 2 or 3, but I'll simply say that there are a lot of elements of Matt's campaign that have ties leading back to the Calamity, this huge apocalypse that lasted for more than a century and occurred several thousand years ago, or nearly 1,000 years ago. The vestiges of the Divergence, the Sun Tree, some ruins and wastelands are introduced in Campaign 2, they're all connected to this major magical war between the gods. And once again, I do kind of wish that more of Matt's plot points were connected to other aspects of his world. Otherwise, when it all seems to keep linking back to the Calamity, it makes the Calamity feel like the thing that has happened in the backstory of Exandria. But there's a trade-off there that does have value, because his players understand the Calamity. Whenever it gets brought up, his players know what Matt is referencing. To demonstrate the value of that, we can contrast the Calamity with Winter's Crest. In Matt's world, Winter's Crest is a holiday that commemorates a victory over an ice titan named Everon the Rime Lord. Now they celebrate with a winter festival every year. So, it's Fantasy Christmas. He wanted to do a Christmas episode of his home D&D game, so he made up a holiday that would help justify that. But his players learned about that lore in their home game like 10 years ago, and from what I can tell, they didn't really interact with this lore in any meaningful way. It wasn't really relevant to the story or the adventure, it was just some backstory Matt gave them as the reason for the season. And to make matters worse, the event is only celebrated in Tal'Dorei, so their future campaigns in other continents never give them any opportunity to interface with this lore ever again. Matt frequently has to remind his players that Winter's Crest is not celebrated anywhere outside of Tal'Dorei, but because it comes up so rarely, this knowledge doesn't really stick. For most of the run of Critical Role, Matt's players don't really seem to know the backstory behind Winter's Crest because it never comes up, and it's not really relevant to the game. If they do know the lore, it's because they picked it up from the setting guides they published, not from the game they're playing together. But his players never have this problem with the Calamity. Thanks to the way it connects to different aspects of the setting and the ways that the lore has been relevant to their campaign, they have a much better sense of what the Calamity is. More than that, each new detail does add dimension to the Calamity and builds out a more complete image of the event as a whole. For example, when the players visit a wasteland in Campaign 2, they learn that this land was blighted during the Calamity. That's important world building for them to know. There really is no area of Tal'Dorei that still shows such obvious, enduring wounds from the Calamity, so seeing this region in Campaign 2 demonstrates the scope of this devastation that the apocalypse left on Exandria, now that they can actually see visible scarring. Additionally, when the players later discover some ruins that predate the Calamity, they learn a lot about what the world's culture and technology was like in the days before the Calamity, and it is fascinating. And of course, the Calamity did involve the gods, so as the player characters get higher level and start interacting with the gods more and more, the fact that there was once a war between the gods winds up being kind of relevant. Honestly, my philosophy about how Whirlpool worldbuilding is secretly bad is directly challenged by the fact that Matt spent so much time reminding his players about the Calamity. His players were eventually able to play a game set during the Calamity, and they more or less knew what to expect because the concepts around it had been so frequently reinforced during Matt's games. And in fact, they're literally doing a second Calamity-themed miniseries as we speak. The finale airs tonight if I get this video up on time, because once again, the Calamity has become relevant to their current campaign. So, how much does any of this matter? I'm fully aware that this might just be something that bothers me, but if you are like me, and you think diving into the Whirlpool over and over reduces what makes the setting exciting in one of the ways that we've talked about today, then you're probably asking the same question I put in the title of this video. How do you avoid Whirlpool worldbuilding? And the truth is, you actually do just have to make an effort to do something that is completely distinct from the Whirlpool that keeps pulling you in. This doesn't mean that you never dive into the Whirlpool. They pull you in for a reason. They're fun. But if you want your world to feel bigger and more real, I do strongly recommend you sometimes take the effort to fully distance yourself from the big focus point of your lore that you tend to gravitate toward. Matt Mercer used the Chroma Conclave arc to make the Calamity relevant to the story through the Vestiges of Divergence. But he also used it to move the players all over the world so he could draw their attention to other points of interest and continue building out his world. The first Fantastic Beasts movie worked pretty well, and while I don't think it ever needed to be a franchise, it probably could have had a chance if they had focused on making movies about the Harry Potter version of the Crocodile Hunter, rather than pivoting immediately to try to turn these movies into a young Dumbledore series. Honestly, even that could have worked if they just committed to it, and that includes not chickening out and pulling a bunch of weird no-homo bullshit between Dumbledore and Grindelwald. The live-action Hobbit movies were always going to be a challenge to adapt, but trying to make them more like Lord of the Rings was the easy answer, and it was also very clearly the wrong answer. But maybe our best example comes from Star Wars, because while they certainly do return to the Jedi Whirlpool a lot, they do have another lever they can pull when they want to get away from it. They can jump into the world of smugglers and bounty hunters. That's what The Mandalorian was supposed to be, and the same goes for the Book of Boba Fett. And even Solo is mostly a fun smuggler romp, although it falls into a lot of the frustrating prequel pitfalls that make me want to pull my hair out, but that's something we can discuss another day. Even in the world of video games, we're about to get Star Wars Outlaws, and I don't know if it's going to be any good, but it does seem like it's deliberately trying to move away from the Jedi as the focus for that story, and I appreciate that. And if and when the creators also want to shift away from telling stories about smugglers and bounty hunters, they can go to their third lever, rebels fighting against the Empire. In fact, those three categories, Jedi, smugglers/bounty hunters, and rebels, were the three categories used to distinguish the Star Wars RPGs published by Fantasy Flight Games. When you're talking about the Rebels corner of Star Wars, obviously that includes the Rebels TV show and Rogue One, but also includes the most well-regarded new installment in Star Wars, Andor. And unlike Rebels and Rogue One, which both dabble in Jedi content, Andor has no Jedi in it. At least that's what it seems like. I haven't seen it yet. Although... One second. Does Andor have Jedi in it? No, Andor does not have any Jedi in it. Okay, that's what I thought. I have not had a chance to watch the show yet. I want to, I promise, I just didn't have time before making this video, but I'm getting to it. It's next on my queue. But the point is this. If you want to pull back from the Whirlpool, it does require conscious effort. And you obviously don't have to stay away from it indefinitely. There is an appeal to going back to the Whirlpool and seeing what other interesting stories can be told in that corner of your world. But I do encourage you to at least try to divert yourself away from it early in your world building, just as I'm going to do with my own setting. The reason Star Wars can spin off and do stories about Jedi and rebels and smugglers/bounty hunters is because all three of those were present early on in the franchise. They're not locked into only telling stories about the Jedi. On the other hand, the reason the Harry Potter franchise can't get away from Hogwarts is because all the world building focused on Hogwarts early on and the rest of the setting suffered. So when I move on to the next corner of my campaign setting, I'm very deliberately going to try to steer away from not just the Sea of Curses, but also hopefully avoid the same sort of themes that are present in that section of my setting by instead focusing on something totally different. Because in my opinion, branching out early on will help prevent any one corner of my setting from becoming a whirlpool that continues to draw me into future installments. You need to, in effect, imagine what can be, unburdened by what has been. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. We have a new Democratic candidate, and I feel hope for the first time in years, so you're getting even more politics in my videos for the next few months, so buckle up for that. But let me know in the comments. What do you think of this topic of Whirlpool world building? Is this something that you think is helpful to keep in mind when designing your own world? Is this just a me problem and it doesn't bother you at all? Do you just want to tell me I'm wrong about Star Wars and the Rings of Power? Let me know in the comments below. While you're down there, make sure to like and subscribe and ring the bell. That helps the channel a whole lot. Consider supporting me on Patreon, but also, we talked a little bit about J.K. Rowling and how she's just an awful person, so there should be a fundraiser on this video to support trans people. Check it out down below. Let's show it some love. The fundraiser in my Thanos video raised more than $700 for the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which is incredible. Thank you so much. And so if you're able and willing to donate again, check out the link below. I would also love it if you would join my Discord server. You'll get to hang out with a bunch of other awesome people, and make sure to sign up for my mailing list. I've got some very exciting updates coming up very soon. Click here to watch my Pirates of the Caribbean video. It's a really good one. And if you're in the US, make sure you're registered to vote. That link is in the doobly-doo as well. Until next time, play fair, and have fun.